All right, let's dive into some deep philosophical waters today, shall we?
Sounds intriguing.
We're tackling the problem of perception, and I think this one's especially interesting for anyone who, considers themselves a bit of a philosophy buff.
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic for a reason.
So if you've ever found yourself wondering how we can be sure the world we see and hear and touch actually matches up with reality,
Right. How do we know it's not all just some kind of elaborate illusion?
you're in the right place.
This question has kept philosophers busy for centuries.
And to make this deep dive even more, well,
We're going to approach it with a philosopher's mindset.
exactly. We're going to dig into those nitty-gritty details, the kind of arguments and distinctions that really get to the heart of the problem.
Because it's not just about whether our senses can be tricked.
No, it goes way beyond those optical illusions and, dreams.
It's about the very foundation of our knowledge about the world. It's about how we justify our beliefs. How do we know that what we perceive is actually true?
So, to guide our exploration today,
We're turning to a classic source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
it's like a treasure trove of philosophical arguments and perspectives.
And it offers a pretty comprehensive overview of the problem of perception, along with a whole bunch of potential solutions.
Some of them get pretty metaphysical, too.
Oh yeah, we're going to be venturing into some mind-bending territory.
But before we get to those solutions,
It's important to really lay out the challenge itself.
all right, so hit me with it. What exactly is the problem of perception? Why is it such a headache for philosophers?
Well, imagine you're looking at let's say, a red apple,
Seems simple enough, right?
but then a skeptic comes along
Uh-oh, here we go.
and they ask, hold on a second, how do you know you're really seeing an apple?
And they wouldn't just leave it at that, would they?
Of course not. They'd go on to say, what you're directly perceiving might just be an experience of an apple, not the apple itself.
So they're saying there's this, veil of perception between us and the real world.
Exactly. They argue that what we directly perceive are just appearances.
Appearances, sense data, representation,
Those lovely philosophical terms.
but not the actual apple, not the thing in itself.
Precisely. And this is the first part of a classic skeptical argument against the reliability of our senses. It's often called the indirectness principle.
Catchy name. So the indirectness principle states that we only have direct access to these appearances, not to the actual objects themselves.
That's the gist of it. And you can see how this sets the stage for a whole lot of trouble.
Oh yeah, because if we're only ever dealing with appearances,
Then how can we ever be sure that they accurately reflect reality?
how do we know we're not being tricked? Or that our senses aren't giving us a distorted view of things?
That's the million-dollar question. And that brings us to the second part of the skeptical argument, which often goes by the name of the meta-evidential principle.
Okay, the meta-evidential principle, what's that all about?
Well, this principle states that in order for us to be justified in believing that we're seeing a real apple,
Not just an apple appearance.
right, we need good reasons to think that those appearances are accurate. Philosophers use a fancy word for this, veridical.
Veridical. So it's not enough to just have the experience of seeing an apple. I also need to have evidence, justification, for believing that this experience is actually tracking something real.
You got it. And that's where things start to get really tricky. Because how do you gather evidence for the reliability of your senses without relying on your senses in the first place?
Right. It's like trying to prove that a map is accurate by only looking at the map itself.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most unsettling part of the skeptical argument.
I'm already feeling unsettled, but go on.
It's what philosophers call the no good reason claim.
The no good reason claim. Okay, so what's the bad news?
Well, the skeptic argues that we simply lack good reasons for believing that our perceptions are veridical.
So we're stuck with those appearances.
We're trapped in our own sensory bubbles, and any attempt to break free, to verify our perceptions, seems to lead to that circular trap you mentioned earlier.
I see the dilemma. It's like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Philosophers have a snappy little acronym for this three-pronged skeptical attack. PEW.
PUW.
Yep, it stands for the three principles we just outlined.
Let me see if I remember. We've got the indirectness principle.
That's the one about only perceiving appearances.
Right. Then the meta-evidential principle.
Which says we need good reasons to think those appearances are accurate.
And finally, the no good reason claim.
The skeptic's grand finale.
PPW. We'll have to remember that one. So if this PPW argument is right,
If the skeptics are onto something.
does that mean all our beliefs about the world are built on shaky ground? Does that mean we can never be sure of anything?
Well, that's the question that has kept philosophers up at night for a long, long time.
And I have a feeling it's a question we're going to be wrestling with for the rest of this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get to those potential solutions, before we see how philosophers have tried to escape this skeptical maze,
I think it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the sheer ingenuity of this skeptical argument.
I agree, even if it's a bit unnerving.
It really forces us to examine the foundations of our knowledge.
To question those assumptions we often take for granted about how we know the world.
It reminds us that even our most basic beliefs,
Those beliefs about the things we see and hear and touch all around us.
they're not as simple or as straightforward as they might seem.
And for a philosopher, that's a pretty exciting thought.
It's an invitation to dig deeper, to explore those hidden complexities, to really grapple with the relationship between our minds and the world.
So, for all you philosophy enthusiasts out there, what are your initial reactions to this PDW argument?
Does it leave you feeling skeptical, intrigued, or maybe a bit of both?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, so we've laid out this skeptical challenge to perception with this PTW argument.
It's a tough one to shake.
It really makes you question how we can ever be sure that our senses are giving us the real deal, you know?
It's a classic philosophical problem.
Now I'm really curious, how have philosophers tried to wrestle with these ideas?
Well, philosophers love a good puzzle,
And this is definitely a puzzle.
and they've come up with a whole range of responses to skepticism about perception.
I bet there's a lot of debate about this.
Oh, absolutely. But we can broadly categorize these responses into, let's say, two main camps.
Okay, two different strategies.
The first camp tackles the problem metaphysically.
Metaphysically, so they're going deep.
They're rethinking the very nature of reality itself, trying to dissolve that gap between appearance and reality that the skeptics are so worried about.
Right, because if there is no gap,
Then the problem kind of disappears.
however,
One of the most, I guess you could say, radical moves in this metaphysical game
I like radical.
is idealism.
Idealism, now that rings a bell.
We might have touched on this briefly earlier, but it's the idea that reality is fundamentally mental.
Okay, so the world we experience.
It's essentially a construct of our minds.
So is this like saying the world is a giant collective dream?
You're getting close. There are many different flavors of idealism, but they all share this core idea that there is no fundamental gap between appearance and reality.
Because reality is experience.
Exactly. The world is what we perceive it to be.
So if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, not only does it not make a sound,
But maybe there wasn't even a tree to begin with.
whoa, that's a real mind bender. It's all dependent on a mind to perceive it.
That's the somewhat unsettling implication of idealism.
It sounds kind of like The Matrix almost.
Yeah, you can see the parallels.
But it's not just science fiction.
Oh no, idealism is a serious philosophical contender. It's been defended by some brilliant minds throughout history.
And I can see how it directly tackles that indirectness principle.
From the PEW argument.
Yeah, if everything is ultimately mental, then perception becomes much more straightforward.
Absolutely. No more worrying about whether appearances match up with some external world.
Because the world is the appearances.
Pretty neat, right?
I mean, it's a pretty wild idea, but I can see the logic.
Idealism isn't the only metaphysical game in town, though.
Oh, there are more.
There's another approach, one that's maybe a little more grounded in our, everyday intuitions.
Oh, okay, bring it on.
It's called direct realism.
Direct realism, so what's that all about?
Direct realists insist that we actually do perceive external objects directly.
Directly.
No need for any mental intermediaries or representations.
So when I see that red apple,
You're seeing the apple itself.
not just some mental image of it.
Nope. Your senses are giving you the unfiltered truth.
That definitely has a more common sense appeal.
It does. For many people, it feels more intuitive than this idea that reality is, a mind-dependent construct.
Right, it's less matrixy.
But of course, direct realism faces its own set of challenges.
I bet it does. Nothing's ever easy in philosophy. What are some of the issues?
Well, for starters, how do you explain hallucinations or illusions or even dreams?
Right, those times when our perception clearly doesn't match up with what's, really out there in the world.
Exactly. If we're directly plugged into reality.
How come the plug seems to come loose sometimes?
That's the question that direct realists have to grapple with.
Makes you wonder if there's a way to reconcile those two, right? Like the intuitive appeal of direct realism with those cases where our senses seem to go haywire.
Well, there are different flavors of direct realism that try to address this challenge.
Oh, I knew there had to be.
One prominent version is called disjunctivism.
Disjunctivism, that's a mouthful.
It is, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward.
Okay, I'm listening.
Disjunctivists argue that there's a fundamental difference in the kind of mental state we're in when we're having a veridical perception.
Veridical meaning we're actually perceiving something real.
Right, versus when we're having a hallucination.
So it's not just that the content of my experience is different, like seeing a real cat versus hallucinating one.
It's deeper than that.
It's that the very structure of the experience itself is different.
Depending on whether it's connected to something real out there in the world.
So like there are two separate tracks for perception. One's grounded in reality and the other one's not.
Exactly. And this distinction, disjunctivists argue, allows us to have justified beliefs in those cases of veridical perception. We're not relying on appearances because, in those cases, there are no appearances, only direct engagement with reality.
Okay, I think I'm following. But even with all these metaphysical moves, don't we still run into a problem?
What's that?
Well, even if I'm directly perceiving a real apple, let's say,
Assuming the disjunctivists are right.
how do I know that I am? How do I justify that belief?
You've hit on a crucial point.
I do that sometimes.
While these metaphysical solutions can reshape our understanding of the relationship between mind and world,
They might give us a different picture of how perception works.
right, but they don't fully solve the problem of justification. Even if we accept some form of direct access to reality, we still need good reasons to believe that we're having that kind of access in any given moment, and that's where epistemological solutions come in.
All right, so the epistemologists are stepping up to the plate now.
They're ready to tackle the question of justification head on.
Instead of just redefining reality, they're going to give us a way to, figure out whether our beliefs are actually warranted.
Exactly. And they have a whole range of approaches up their sleeves, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
This is getting exciting. I'm ready to explore those epistemological battlegrounds. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've been, on this journey exploring the problem of perception, that classic philosophical question of how can we be sure that the world we experience actually matches up with reality?
Yeah, it's a question that keeps coming back.
We've laid out the skeptical challenge, that PUW argument.
Those tricky skeptics.
And we even, took a detour into the realm of metaphysics with idealism and direct realism.
We had to cover all the bases, right?
But now it's time to see how epistemologists tackle this challenge head on.
They're not afraid of a good philosophical brawl.
Yeah, so epistemology, that's the study of knowledge, right?
Yep. It's all about digging into those questions of justification.
So it's not just about having beliefs about the world.
It's about what makes those beliefs justified.
How do we sort out the good beliefs from the bad ones? The knowledge from mere opinion or, lucky guesses?
Epistemologists want to see the evidence, so to speak.
Show me the receipts. So how do they apply this idea of justification to our perceptions? What kind of evidence can we gather to support our belief that we're seeing, a real tree, not just some figment of our imagination?
Well, one of the most influential approaches within epistemology is called evidentialism. It's all about the importance of having good reasons or evidence for our beliefs.
So it's kind of like a courtroom, right?
Yeah.
You need to present evidence to the jury to convince them that your claims are true.
Exactly. You can't just say, I believe this, therefore it's true.
You need to back it up with something solid. So how does this apply to perception? How do we gather evidence for the reliability of our senses?
Well, one prominent evidentialist approach is called classical foundationalism.
Okay, classical foundationalism. What's the foundation?
The foundation, in this case, is our own sensory experiences.
Our appearances.
Exactly. Classical foundationalists argue that while we don't directly perceive external objects, we do have direct access to how things seem to us.
So it's like building a house. You start with a solid foundation of basic beliefs about how things appear to us, and then you build up from there, constructing those more complex beliefs about the world.
That's a great analogy, but of course there's a catch.
There's always a catch in philosophy.
Remember that no good reason claim from the PEW argument?
Oh yeah, the skeptic's favorite weapon.
They argue that we can't really justify our beliefs about the external world because any attempt to do so seems to rely on perception itself.
Back to that circular trap. So how do these classical foundationalists escape this circularity problem?
Yeah.
How do they show that our foundational beliefs, those beliefs based on appearances, are actually reliable?
Well, one way they've tried to do this is by appealing to a special kind of justification. They argue that our awareness of appearances is so direct, so immediate, that it provides a kind of bedrock certainty.
So those foundational beliefs don't need any further justification. It's like saying, hey, I'm seeing red, therefore I know I'm seeing red. The experience itself carries its own guarantee of truth.
You got it. It's a kind of seeing as believing approach to justification.
Makes sense? But even the most, dedicated foundationalists will admit that not all of our perceptions are so clear-cut. What about those blurry or ambiguous experiences?
Right, those cases where it's not so obvious what we're perceiving.
How do we justify those beliefs?
Well, this is where some foundationalists turn to inference. They argue that we can, infer the reliability of our senses from the overall coherence and consistency of our experiences. It's like saying, hey, the fact that my perceptions generally fit together and make sense suggests that they're more likely to be accurate than not.
So we're looking for patterns, consistency, track record of success.
Exactly. If our senses have been pretty reliable in the past, then we have some reason to trust them in the present. It's kind of like trusting a friend who's always giving you good advice.
You trust them because they've earned that trust over time.
Right. Of course, this kind of inferential justification doesn't provide that rock-solid certainty that some philosophers are looking for.
Because it's always possible, however unlikely, that our senses could be deceiving us.
Right, even if they've been mostly reliable in the past.
And let's be honest, these intricate arguments about justification, this isn't really how most people go about their day.
No, not at all.
We don't stop and ponder the reliability of our senses every time we, reach for a cup of coffee or cross the street.
Right, it would be pretty exhausting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we'd never get anything done. And that brings us to, some alternative approaches to justification.
Approaches that might capture our everyday experience a bit better.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What have we got?
One such approach is called reliabilism.
Reliabilism. Okay, so I'm guessing this one focuses on reliability, as the name suggests.
You got it. Reliabilism shifts the focus from the evidence we have for a belief.
So it's not about the reasons I can give for believing something.
It's about the process by which that belief was formed.
So is it kind of like it doesn't matter so much what I believe about the reliability of my senses? It's more about whether those senses are actually reliable in a more objective sense?
Exactly. The key idea is that a belief is justified if it's produced by a reliable cognitive process, a process that tends to produce true beliefs.
So my belief that there's a tree in front of me is justified if my visual system, the process of seeing, is generally reliable in producing true beliefs about the presence of trees.
That's the gist of it. And this leads to some interesting implications.
Like what?
Well, for instance, a creature with no conscious awareness of its own perceptual processes.
So something like a philosophical zombie.
Exactly. They could still have justified perceptual beliefs.
Hold on. Are you saying a zombie could have knowledge?
Well, that depends on how you define knowledge. But according to reliabilism, justification doesn't require conscious access to reasons or evidence.
It's more about whether the belief-forming process is reliable, regardless of whether the believer is aware of that process.
That's right. It's a more externalist view of justification, focusing on the reliability of the process itself, rather than the internal mental states of the believer.
So it's kind of like our brains are doing the justifying behind the scenes. We don't need to be consciously aware of all the inner workings of perception to have justified beliefs about the world.
That's a good way to put it. Of course, reliabilism has its own set of challenges. For example, how do we determine which processes are truly reliable? And what about those cases where a normally reliable process produces a false belief? Is that belief still justified?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
There are a lot of details to work out, but I think
Yeah.
it's a really interesting approach that, deserves serious consideration.
Definitely. It seems to connect more with, our everyday experience of perception, which is often a lot about conscious reasoning and more about just automatically processing sensory information.
Right, it's more intuitive in a way. And speaking of intuitive,
There's another family of solutions we haven't touched on yet, right?
we do the world-involving approaches.
Oh, right. These are the ones that emphasize the direct connection between our minds and the world.
They say that connection is crucial for justification.
So it's not just about having a belief that happens to be true, or even having a belief that was formed by a reliable process. It's about actually being in touch with reality.
You got it. World-involving approaches, sometimes called epistemological disjunctivism, argue that there's this unique kind of justification we have when we're directly engaged with the world, through veridical perception.
So it's about that special relationship between the perceiver and the perceived.
Exactly. And for those who endorse this view, that direct connection is what provides the ultimate justification for our perceptual beliefs. It's a kind of grounding that simply isn't present in those cases of hallucination or illusion.
Because when you're hallucinating, there's nothing real out there anchoring your experience.
Right, it's all in your head, so to speak.
That makes sense. But how do we know when we're in that special state of veridical perception? How do we tell the difference between genuine perception and, those cases where our senses are leading us astray?
That's a great question, and it's one that philosophers are still debating.
There's always more to explore in philosophy. So after all this philosophical exploration, after delving into these different perspectives on the problem of perception,
After wrestling with skeptics, idealists, direct realists, foundationalists, reliabilists, and even those world-involving folks.
where does it leave us? Have we managed to escape those clutches of skepticism?
Well, I think it's safe to say that we've gained a much deeper understanding of the challenges involved in justifying our perceptual beliefs.
We've explored some really fascinating ideas along the way.
And even if there's no single, universally accepted solution, engaging with these different perspectives.
It helps us appreciate the complexity of perception, the intricate relationship between our minds and the world, and the very nature of knowledge itself.
And that's what philosophy is all about, isn't it? Expanding our understanding, questioning our assumptions, and delving into those big questions that have puzzled thinkers for centuries.
Absolutely. So next time you see a tree or hear a bird sing or, smell a freshly baked cookie,
Take a moment to appreciate the wonder and the mystery of perception.
because behind those everyday experiences.
Lies a whole world of philosophical questions just waiting to be explored.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the problem of perception.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those philosophical minds engaged.